So amazing to be here with you all this morning. I've been helping lead a church that meets in the evening, and so when I speak there, I get up and I have to say, "Good evening, church," and it's really hard and I struggle, so I got to get my good morning knocks out of the way, and I thank you for that. You know, when Dave and Becca asked me to come and speak this morning, I was thrilled, and they told me they were doing Old Testament stories and characters and so on. Super excited, and I thought, I'm gonna think about this for a while. And I thought, and then all the good ones were taken. So we're gonna do Job. I have to ask, as a participant, I never liked, audience engagement, but up here, I always think I like it. So who's like a big Job fan, like really? Thank you. There's one more weird one in the room. But I am a big Job fan, and forgive me for the, lumping you in with my weirdness, but I am a big Job fan. It took me a really long time. But I hope this morning, maybe we can get a little more friendly with Job and his crazy story, and get a little more friendly with the God who gave us that story, and allow that story to become part of the journey that God has each one of us on. So we're going to do this, but we're not just going to preach from Job or on Job. We're going to preach Job. So we're going to try something crazy, and I better look at the clock. You guys get out of here at about 2, I think, right? Because I'm going to preach all of Job. Chapters. So he already cut my mic. 42 chapters of epic Hebrew poetry. Buckle up. So, look, we got to get into this. I'm going to set a baseline, and then we're going to really kind of talk about the structure, and then we're going to get into the chapter by chapter, verse by verse, word by word, sort of. And then we're going to wrap it all up at the end and give you a sense of what's here for you to walk out of here with. So the baseline, Job is poetry. It's important to carry that around. Job is theology. Job is not history. So I will say more about these things as we go. But if you know the story of Job, some stuff in there is kind of wild. And it's important that we not get hung up on it as a history, but we experience it and we embrace it as it was given and intended as poetry. So Job is poetry and theology, not history. And so as a poem, Job is using a dramatic context set in extremes. And I'm going to say more on that in a minute. As a poem, I want to say this, and I want you to try to remember this. Job is better experienced than reasoned. To come to poetry differently than we come to some other things. So Job is better experienced than reasoned, and I want to invite you to join me right now in the shared holy expectation that the Spirit of God wants to speak to you in and through Job, and wants to invite you and me to keep going on our transformative and healing journeys with and through this powerful poem. So let's talk about the structure. So Job falls into 5 key sections, chapters 1 and 2, called a prologue, and it sets up the problem and introduces most of the main characters. And those characters, I can't resist this here. I have to, when you read through Old Testament stuff, there's always a bunch of fun names, right? And you sort of stumble over them or just move on. But we've got Eliphaz, the Temanite, and Zophar, the Naamathite, and my favorite guy, known as the shortest guy in the Bible, Bildad the Shuhite. Is that new? Thank you for the groans. I had to work in one sort of dad jokey kind of thing. And then we've got Elihu, son of Barakel, the Buzzite. So we've got a bunch of ites, and Job's got some interesting friends. And so that's 1 and 2, this prologue, and it really sets up the problem and it introduces the main characters. And then it moves into this big section, chapters 3 through 31, and basically Job and his 3 friends spend their time arguing. So that's fun. But in that space, there's a lot going on. But maybe some of you are into like reality TV and some of the dramatic stuff. This is kind of like that. You get in there and they're just saying things and being dramatic, and it's all kind of wild stuff going on. So there's a nice big chunk of that if you're into that sort of thing. And then it moves on. I have to say before, in that section though, chapter 28. Chapter 28 is one of the keys. It's the center of this book. Everything hinges on chapter 28 in Job. Chapters 26 through 31 is a big speech from Job. Right in the middle of that, there's this whole big thing on wisdom. And as far as wisdom goes, Aaron nailed that for us this morning, so we can maybe cut this short. But perfect tie-in about figuring out how we should live, basically. So then the next section, 32 through 37, we get this speech from a guy named Elihu. He's not introduced earlier. He's not addressed later. I don't know where he came from. I don't know who he is. He might have just been walking by. But he gets a spot here, and as far as I know, nobody else has any idea either. If you know, help me know. Then the whole poem begins to wrap up. 38 through 42, God speaks. And I want to say, when you're reading Old Testament, if you don't know, one of the things to watch out for is the word Lord, God, this kind of language, right? Because there are different words that get translated differently into English, and those words have different meaning. Most of Job deals with God as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord, which, if you don't know, is God's covenant name, Yahweh. As we deal with this stuff in Job, with the brutality of it, with the loss of it, with the pain of it, with the confusion of it, throughout all that's happening here, it's not just a God of power, but it's a God of relationship. It's a God of covenant. It's a God of love. It's a God of promise. And so we keep it in mind that the poetry given here uses Yahweh, God's covenant name, when referring to God. And then finally, the epilogue, chapter 42, and that's where we get some real resolution. The whole thing kind of gets wrapped up. And just for funsies, let's do a quick reading. I'm going to just read for you chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, and then we'll talk about these sections as we go along. And then, as I said, we'll wrap it all up for you in the end. So it says in chapter 1, verse 1, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. So remember I said Job is poetry and theology, not history. It's set in a context of drama and extremes. This is an example of some of that language. This guy is uber wealthy. This guy has more sheep than you can count trying to fall asleep. He's got so many kids. He's got everything. And not only that, he's the greatest guy in all the East. That's like half the world. It's extreme, dramatic language. Painted this way, Job just reads to me like this guy that I don't want to talk to at the reunion, you know? Like, okay, get over it. You got sheep. Fine. But the story moves on, and you get this crazy dialogue between God and Satan. And so, like, God and the angels are hanging out up in heaven, which is great. And then suddenly Satan just shows up, like the guy in the back left the door open. I don't know. Why is Satan here? I didn't think he was allowed back in there, but here he is. And God is painted weirdly here. And he looks at Satan, he's like, oh, hey, have have you noticed Job? Well, that's a strange thing to do to a guy that you like. Let's put Satan's attention on him. Hey, have you noticed Job? He's good. Satan's like, yeah, he's good, but only because you gave him everything and you won't let me touch him. I promise you, Satan says to God, if you take away his stuff, take away your protection, he'll curse you to your face. Now, I would love a God who's just like, get out. Nope, that's not what happens here in this poem, in this dramatic, extreme situation. What we get is God says, oh, you're on. A couple of buddies having a bet. Not a big fan, but that's how it goes down in this story. And so God removes those protections and blessings, and Satan is allowed to come after Job in extreme ways. And as the story goes on, and this is where it gets intense. It really gets intense. Job's children are all killed. His wealth is all taken. He loses everything. He loses his health. He loses the support of his wife. He loses the trust of his community. All he has left is his belief in himself. Literally. It's all he's got. Everyone thinks Job must have done something really, really bad to cause all this suffering. And one of the things that we're going to kind of dive a little deeper into is something called the retribution principle. That's what this is. We'll get into more of that later. But fundamentally, it's a theological belief that these guys held that says there is a direct relationship between how righteous you are and how much blessing you get, how unrighteous you are and how much curses fall into your life. Job was super righteous, super blessed. Now he must have really done something awful to get from there all the way to here. And Job's like, I didn't. I really swear I didn't. I didn't do anything, but everybody else believes he did. Even his wife at one point comes to him and says, why don't you, and remember, this is the man who's supposedly responsible because of his bad behavior, whatever it was, for the loss of their children and their wealth and their standing in the community, everything. And so she comes to him finally and says, why don't you just do what Satan said you would do? Curse God and die. It's a bad day. It's a bad day at home. Job's response, so inspirational. Chapter 1, verse 21. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. Says the Lord, Yahweh, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. It does. It sounds inspiring, but it's also super extreme to the point of being ridiculous. This is not the guy who wants showing up at the hospital when I'm in a crisis. I'm like looking for some comfort. Like, let's be honest about how we're really doing here. And he's just throwing out he's holding on, right? That's how it feels to me. He's just holding on. And so he's throwing out some stuff, theological stuff he can hold on to. And when things get real bad, sometimes that's just where we are and what we need. But it is extreme, if not inspiring. And so then in chapter 2, he goes on, he says another big, so he says, this is after his wife told him to curse God and die. He says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Okay. So then, Job's 3 friends arrive. Finally, what feels like, and I might be reading into this because there's some cultural stuff in play here, but Job's 3 friends show up weeping. That feels like the right response to what's been happening. But also sometimes when there's a grief, people would mourn in this culture. They would do kind of intentional mourning. So it's one of those two things. I like to think it's sort of honest, or I like to think that it's appropriate to what's really happening. So they arrive and they arrive at weeping, and then they sit with him in silence for 7 days. 7 days of silence. And I wonder, how long can you or I sit with somebody in their uncomfortable, painful circumstances without saying anything and just sharing in their pain? And I think we should learn something from those 7 days and from how these guys meet this moment. So we got to keep moving. Job chapter 3. This is Job's progression. This is where Job does something really important and he gets real. He gets honest. He meets the moment outside of those theological statements and he allows himself to feel. And I want to suggest to you that this kind of honesty is one of the most essential things that we need for our own journeys of healing, redemption, and restoration from the wounds, from the pain, from the things that all of us carry. Requires moments of honesty. So we learn this also from Job. He says, after this, Job opened his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. And we all, like Job, need to get here. In the Old Testament, the poets and prophets give us all kinds of examples of these getting honest moments and how important they are. And how powerful it is for us to pour out the honesty of our emotions and our pain and our fears into the world with God and in community. And I would suggest to all of us this morning that we're being led by Job to our places of brokenness and pain. And in fact, for all of us who walk with Jesus, this is part of what the journey is. This is part of redemption. So we're being led to these places of honesty and connection to some of our pain, but not so we can stay there. Like with Jesus and like with our baptism, it's just that dying comes before new life. And I would suggest all of us carry some things in our lives, some buried wounds, some traumas and some struggles, some fears and some pains that your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, the one you trust, wants to lead you into, that you might pour them out, that you might be led to dying in that space so that you might be led to rising from that space. So, chapter 3, Job gets real. Moves on, big chunk, chapter 4 through 27. And the friends argue with Job over this retribution principle. And to say just a little bit more about that, this is like our modern or contemporary idea of about what like karma is. So you do bad and bad things come into your life. You do good, good things come into your life. And as I said, everyone thinks Job must have done something horribly wrong. But Job sticks to his story, and in the process, through all these chapters and all this conversation and dialogue and arguing, Job gets so bold in his assertions that he didn't do anything wrong that he even calls out God. God, where are you? Show up. Vindicate me. Justify me. Tell these guys I didn't do it wrong. So he calls out God in this space. And then chapter 28, I mentioned it earlier. Chapter 28 is this amazing interlude on wisdom, and it raises this fundamental question as where can wisdom be found? And the answer given is really only with God. It says, humans are amazing, greater than any of the other animals of the earth. You guys, you figured out where to find gold buried under the ground. Not even the eagles up high can see the things that you see, but where can wisdom be found? In God alone. And then at the end, in chapter 28, verse 28, kind of defines wisdom. And he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. We struggle with the idea of the fear of the Lord, I think. But here it's defined as wisdom. Fearing God. I want to ask you, is your God big enough to fear? I think we fear lots of things, not often enough. The absoluteness of God, the totality, the infinity of it. And so wisdom, how do we live amid all of this mess, the good, the bad? How do we do this? Wisdom, at its root, is for God to be big enough to be feared more than the other things that we fear. And from there, to realize that we need to shun evil, meaning to just get rid of from our lives those things that are harming us. So wisdom is to fear God and to shun evil. And so in our lives, when nothing else makes sense, when we're lost in the mess of it all, this is where we go. And so now in the last two sections, 29 through 37, I'm going to paint in one thing. Basically, Job just continues his lament and his defense of himself, and this new character is introduced. But the whole thing is still stranded in this retribution principle. And now finally, chapters 38 through 42. God speaks from a storm. God could have spoken from all kinds of things. God speaks from a storm. Don't forget where Job has been. If you haven't allowed yourself to connect to what this man, his family, what they've been through, what they've lost, this is what it's here for. Job is better experienced than reasoned. And God shows up and he speaks from a storm. We're Midwesterners, we've been there when the sirens go off and the skies go dark and we don't know if it's going to be our tree that falls down or the neighbor's. Storms can be intense. This is intense. God shows up in Job's life in an intense way while he is as broken as one can be. And he says intense things. So what he says to Job is, have you ever given orders to the morning? I love that line. Or shown the dawn its place. This is God getting big. Job needed help. Job needed a God bigger than Job's struggles and pain and loss. And so God shows up in an intense way, in a really big way. And having been called out by Job, he returns the favor. He says, now, Job, it's your turn. Now you stand up and you speak to me. But he doesn't say it gentle. He doesn't sit down next to him, put his arm around him. It's going to be okay. It pretty much wasn't okay, but he needed a really big, really powerful God, and he needed to connect to that in a hurry. And so God shows up in this intense, intimidating, powerful way, scary way. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? Where were you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you? Where were you when God was putting the stars in their place? And then he says, tell me if you understand. And Job's response is fundamentally, I can't speak. Nothing to say. Does the hawk take flight from your wisdom? And so Job is humbled and quieted in a good way. Not shut up, but quieted by the greatness of God. Job is reminded what it means to fear God and shun evil, and he's gifted with a God that is big enough. So I want to wrap this all up. This last section ties up the poem. Job's friends are rebuked for their bad retribution principle theology, and Job is restored. Nice, tidy bow. But fundamentally, I want to identify the three key things that I think Job does for you that I hope you'll carry with you in some way as we go out from here. Job argues against this retribution principle. He says we don't suffer in this karmic way proportional to our deeds. It might be easy for you to think, well, I'm good there. Okay, I don't buy this retribution principle. I believe in grace. I've been preaching the gospel for like 35 years. And in the last few years, God chose to help me see how much, at some level, maybe there's a lot more than I know, but how much, to use a phrase from one of my favorite authors, Brene Brown, how much I hustle for my worthiness. How much of my sense of self is dependent on my achievements, my performance, the approval of others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Guess what? I'm still locked up in this retribution principle in ways that I never imagined. And I suggest that we as followers of Jesus are on a life's journey of learning to live in grace. So don't just drop this one. Take it with you. So the second thing that Job does for us is it provides a path to explore God and self amid suffering. And so Consider these things. Part of this journey is learning to accept that suffering is. Sometimes we need to try to find responsibility or blame or try to figure it out, but the reality is suffering is. It's part of our journey as humans. And so Job, this poetry provides a path for us to explore God and ourselves in the middle of a suffering world and a suffering life at times. But we also find that in this way, God is present and relational and inviting us into an experience with God that is transformative and healing. The last thing I want to say about this path that Job provides is that agency matters. What you do matters. This isn't a kind of fatalism. And so we see Job in the middle of his suffering journey making some choices, and he chooses to lament, and he chooses to be in community, and he chooses to speak and to wrestle. So even though we have to accept the reality that suffering is in fact part of this journey, we also should act and work to alleviate it in our lives and in the lives of others. And then finally, Job shows us God as bigger than any and every challenge that life has. And we invite God to move into our lives and say things to us like, "Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth?" To speak to us in the storm when we need a God bigger than the circumstances that we face. So I want to invite you now to join with me in prayer, and let's together